right, welcome back to Rock Doc's Reading Room for another episode of my book, Rock Doc. All right, I kind of left you hanging last time. I'm living in London. I've created this big all-in-one production company. Maybe some of you saw the ELP film that I showed of the tour that I did for them in '73. If you haven't, it's up on my Rock Doc page. At any rate, and I'm Putty, an old girlfriend who helped me with getting into Edgar Winter's White Trash. She's married now to Peter Watts, the sound man and road manager of Pink Floyd. Peter and I became good friends. He helped me create the business. And now I'm sitting in London one night and I get a phone call from Peter. And let's see what that phone call was all about. All right. Okay, so Pink Floyd went into the Abbey Road studios in January '73 to finish up the Dark Side of the Moon album, which led to a phone call from Peter. He invited me to come to the studio the following night. The band was finally mixing the album, and Roger Waters was planning to record anyone in the studio who was willing to answer a series of questions he had created. Roger wanted a more human feeling to the record and thought people's spontaneous answers would give him just that. He initially planned to use the answers as a segue between songs, but as he mixed them into the recording, he realized what an integral part of the album they were. I was very excited and couldn't wait to go, but as fate would have it, instead of Abbey Road Studios, I ended up in the emergency room of a London hospital, writhing in pain with my first attack of what turned out to be kidney stones. You know, at the time, I wasn't that disappointed, of course, because I didn't know what was going to happen, and nobody did. And now I have a little surprise. I'm going to do something a little bit differently. A couple of years ago, Putty, Peter's wife. Now, Peter and Putty were in Abbey Road Studios, and they famously are on the Dark Side of the Moon recording. And I asked Putty about it, and so I'm going to play you a couple of minutes of my interview that I did with Putty a few years ago. While she's talking, you'll see some pictures of Putty and Peter, so you can get some context, and I'll be back with you very shortly. All right, bear with me. Okay, here we go. The album, how did you get involved?
Well, we all went to Abbey Road, and as you remember, we invited you, and you got sick that night. Ended up in the hospital. We were in the studio in the hospital.
Yeah, I ended up in a hospital in London with kidney stones. One of the great disappointments of my life.
I know, it would be awful. I can't even imagine.
So tell us what it was like in the studio, while they were doing those sessions.
Well, there were a lot of people in there at the time. Linda and Paul McCartney were recording there. It was at Abbey Road, where the Beatles, of course, are famous for recording. It's a wonderful studio. One of the things that they cooked up was they were going to ask all of us questions. And so that's how those parts, like my part when I said that geezer was cruising for a bruiser.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And
did they ask you a question? Was that an answer to a question?
Yes.
What was the question?
The question was, have you ever hit anybody? And you answer that, and then it'd say, well, who was that person? And did you feel you were in the right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, yes, absolutely.
So who was it?
I've never told anybody. I have never told anybody. No, that's my secret.
Oh, okay.
He knows who he is.
Okay, I'm sure he does. I'm sure. Many a great song line has come from that kind of a situation between people.
Yeah, it really has. And what happened with that is he had said something really bad about my husband to Steve O'Rourke, and my husband got into a lot of trouble. That was when he first started experimenting with drugs, and he went a little bit beyond. Everybody was pretty much doing cocaine and Quaaludes, but he went a little beyond that. We were all worried about him, but this fellow, instead of being concerned, just went and tattletailed on him. So
yeah, right. Not a very nice person.
No, that made me really mad. Not being from the streets or anything, but still a prep school girl can take care of herself. And we were out in the hall. The elevator door opens. I see his face. and I just cold cocked him.
Oh, for real?
Yeah, and the door shuts. It was perfect. It was great, because I'm glad he didn't hit me back. He would have killed me. That's the first and only punch I ever threw in my life.
So not only was he cruising for a bruising, eventually he got that bruising.
I delivered.
You delivered. Okay. We'll leave that line alone at that. But there was another line that you did in Great Gig in the Sky, right?
Yeah, I never said I was frightened of dying. They asked you something that implied you were afraid of dying, and I said, no, I'm not afraid of dying. Although that was a lot easier to say at 22 than it is at 66.
Yeah, I hear you.
I'm still not frightened, but it's a little different.
It's a lot different, I'll tell you. The closer you get, the harder it is to answer that question effectively. Peter also had some sounds, lines, whatever, didn't he?
Yeah, he was laughing. I thought that was him laughing. Then someone else said it was someone else laughing.
I always thought that he was the one who laughs, who gives that.
And the lunatic.
Yeah, the lunatic, exactly. I always had heard, and again, of course, I wasn't there, but you were, that it was Peter who did that outrageous.
Yes, because I was sitting on his belly, tickling him. And when you get it hurts, they're tickling you so much, and that's what they, and then they looped it. So.
Right. I'm sure. All right, I'm going to stop there. And of course, I spoke at length to both Putty and Peter about what happened that evening. And so I'll continue now reading from the book. Peter told me about the evening a few days later. Roger asked anyone and everyone present in the studio, including roadies, studio staff, and invited guests, to answer his questions. Paul and Linda McCartney, as Putty said, showed up, but apparently their answers ended up on the cutting room floor. Although their new guitar player, Henry McCullough, made it onto the record with the memorable line, "I don't know, I was really drunk at the time." Roadie Chris Adamson opens the album with his line, "I've been mad for years, absolutely years, and my friends, Peter and Putty, as Putty told you, are very well represented. It was Peter who contributed the repeated laughter during Brain Damage and Speak to Me, and Putty can be heard saying the geezer is cruising for a bruising, as she explained to you, used in the segue between money and us and them, and her words, "I never said I was frightened of dying," are heard halfway through The Great Gig in the Sky. Maybe the best lines came from Abbey Road's big Irish doorman, Jerry O'Driscoll. Among them were, "I'm not frightened of dying. Any time will do. I don't mind. Why should I be frightened of dying?" Obviously, he was answering that same question. "There's no reason for it. You've got to go sometime." And of course, his words at the very end of the album. "There is no dark side of the moon, really. As a matter of fact, it's all dark." Oh, boy. Yeah, so I'm going to read you one more paragraph, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Peter. Before the ELP tour had started, I was sitting in Peter and Putty's London apartment one day, listening to Peter talk about the upcoming leg of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon tour. So this was after that night, but before Dark Side of the Moon tour actually restarted. It had started, stopped. The band had been out on tour using their own sound, lighting, and production equipment, but Peter knew it could be much better. The production leg of this leg of the tour, he told me, is going to be the most intense ever. I'm going to be the first to do quadraphonic sound live, and I want circus talents to be a part of this tour. I've spoken to Steve, and he agrees. Steve was Steve O'Rourke, Pink Floyd's manager. All right, I'm going to stop there, and on my next segment next week, I'll talk about, the tour and what that was like, and get into a few stories about that. At any rate, though, I want to talk a little bit about Peter. Peter Watts doesn't get enough credit for what he did for the Floyd. He really was the one who helped develop their sound. I'll never forget, he had this bug about doing quadraphonic sound. He had this bug about wanting to be able to create great sound in big open air stadiums. he was a real technophile. I mean, he was this short guy, and he was the first one who I ever knew who had an Austin Mini. So he was a little guy with a little car, and we used to go zipping around London out in the countryside. He was still friendly with his ex-wife, Miv, because he had the two kids, Naomi and Benjamin. And I got to meet Miv, and actually, I went out to her house one day with Peter, and then one day I went out myself. I had an interesting story when I went out to see her myself. We had gotten quite friendly. And of course, Naomi and Ben were real small. And who should be there visiting her but Denny Laine? So it was a very interesting afternoon. Got to meet Denny Laine. Denny Laine, of course, started with the Moody Blues, but then joined Paul McCartney for Wings, and that's probably where most of you know him. Really nice guy. This was back in '73. I don't remember exactly where he was in his career, but that was pretty cool. I met a lot of cool people through Peter. After I was out of the business already, and I had gone back to medical school, and Peter and Putty were still together. I actually went to visit them in St. Petersburg, Florida, one New Year's Eve. I'll never forget this. And they had some friends who were like huge gamblers, and we went out on this boat. It was unbelievable. New Year's Eve on this boat, and I remember they were playing for number one college football. It was Alabama against somebody, I don't remember. And there was unbelievable gambling and drugs. The picture that the picture that you saw of Peter and I might have been taken on that weekend in St. Augustine, Florida. At any rate, the end of the story, not such a nice story. Peter got deeply into drugs. And a couple of years after the Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon tour in 1976, Peter died of a drug overdose. So that was unfortunate, but he was a cool dude, man, and I thank him for getting me involved in that stuff. At any rate, that's it for today. Next week, I'll go on to the Dark Side of the Moon tour and the 13 dates that I did with the Floyd on that tour. All right, let's hear this one more time. All right, I hope you enjoyed it, and catch me somewhere, and I'll see you next week for another episode of Rock Doc's Reading Room. Bye.